Hello, everyone online and those who are here. Welcome to Tuesday night Torah study. And before we begin, why don't we open with prayer? Heavenly Father, Yahweh, Abba, we thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to meet freely, to discuss your word in the open without fear of being in danger. We thank you for your word. And we thank you for the instruction that comes from it. Father, I pray that you bless those who are listening and those who are here. Help us to understand and gain more insight from this, and help me to do a good job in delivering the message that you want me to deliver. And I ask this in Yeshua HaMashiach's name. Amen. So before we begin, I posted a picture up here, and this picture will kind of tell the story, or at least set the theme of what I see here in Leviticus and in much of the Torah, quite frankly. In chapter 16, as a quick review, we discussed the Day of Atonement. We discussed, which is Yom Kippur. We discussed sin and the sin offering. And we also stressed how the priests were supposed to approach Yahweh. They just couldn't come in any kind of way they wanted to, especially since they were carrying the weight or the burden of the sins of the whole nation, and how they had to approach one, covering for the sins for themselves, and then the sin of the nation, and then basically we talked about the scapegoat a little bit. So what is the book of Leviticus really about? I hope this image will give us a clue while we continue to go into chapter 17, verse 1. I'd like to get somebody to read chapter 17, verse 1 through 15. Thank you, Jerry. We have Jerry Watkins in the house here.
Can I go all the way through verse 16?
If you choose, yes.
And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing which Yahweh has commanded, saying, Any man, whosoever of the house of Israel, who kills an ox or lamb or goat in the camp, or who kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tent of meeting to offer it an offering before Yahweh, before the tabernacle of Yahweh, blood will be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man will be cut off from among his people to the end of the children, and to that end the children of Israel may bring their offerings, which they offer in the open field, even that they may bring them to Yahweh, to the door of the tent of meeting, to the priest, and offer them for a peace offering to Yahweh. And the priest will sprinkle the blood on the altar of Yahweh at the door of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a sweet savor to Yahweh. And they will no longer offer their offerings to evil spirits after whom they have gone astray. This will be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. And you will say to them, Whatever man there is in the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, that offers a burnt offering or a feast offering, and does not bring it to the door of the tent of meeting to offer it up to Yahweh, even that man will be cut off from among his people. And whatever man there is of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, who eats any manner of blood, I shall even set my face against that one who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for your lives on the altar. For it is the blood that makes atonement for a life. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, No one of you will eat blood, neither will any stranger that lives among you eat blood. And whatever man there is of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, who hunts and catches any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he will even pour out its blood and cover it with dust. For it is the life of all flesh. Its blood is for its life. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, You will eat the blood of no manner of flesh, for the life of all the flesh is its blood, and whoever eats it will be cut off. And everyone who eats that which died of itself, or that which was torn by beasts, whether it is one of your own country or a stranger, he will both wash his clothes and immerse himself in water and be unclean until evening, and then he will be clean. But if he does not wash them or immerse his flesh, then he will bear his iniquity.
Thank you, Jerry.
Welcome.
So the question we'll begin with is, according to the first several verses, where were all animal sacrifices to be carried out? Welcome, Ralphie, Wanda, Ashanti, Joanna. Thank you guys for joining us. Where were the animal sacrifices to be carried out? Go right ahead.
At the tabernacle.
Okay. So did this mean that they would slaughter them outside or inside?
The outer court,
Thank you.
the brazen altar and labor.
Thank you very much. So you see the image there. I'm going to give you a clue as to what this represents, in my opinion. This is from Job 26:10, and it says, "He drew a limit on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness." As I started looking through Leviticus, especially chapter 17, but all through Leviticus, and I would say all through the Torah, what I started to see as a pattern are boundaries. Boundaries that were established. Bless Yahweh, O my being. My Elohim, you have been very great. You have put on excellency and splendor, covering yourself with light as a garment, stretching out the heavens like a curtain, who is laying out the beams of his upper rooms in the waters, who is making thick clouds, Ralphie, clouds again, his chariot, who is walking on the wings of the wind, making his messengers, the winds, his servants, a flame of fire. He established the earth on its foundations so it would not totter forever. You covered it with the deep as a garment. Waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they flee. At the voice of your thunder they hurry away. They go up to the mountains. They go down to the valleys, to the place which you founded for them. You did set a boundary. They do not pass over. They do not return to cover the earth. Psalm 104, 1 through 9. So last week when we talked about how the priests were supposed to approach in chapter 16, and they could not come any way they wanted to, I see that as God establishing boundaries to protect the lives of the priests so that they don't enter the wrong way and enter and die. That was said several times in the chapter 16, lest they die. Prior to that, we talked about the Matzorah, the one who had Zaharet. The Father established the boundaries for that type of skin condition to be, they would be outside of the camp. And there was a certain protocol that had to be processed, or a ritual in order for that Matzorah to be reunited with the congregation, with the fellowship, with the camp. Here's another one. You have set all borders on the earth. You have made summer and winter. Psalm 74:17. Proverbs 23:10. Do not move the ancient boundary. Proverbs 23:10. So, boundaries. We would expect that if God is serious about something that would be for our benefit and not our harm, he would establish the boundaries that we should abide in. I'm seeing this all through the chapter of Leviticus, and I'm also seeing it regarding the prohibition on blood, boundaries. So what was the punishment? Or better yet, when an Israelite sacrificed an animal, what type of offering was it supposed to be? And this is in the first 15, 16 verses. It should be early on there. I'll go ahead and answer. It was a korban offering to Elohim. These offerings were to be slaughtered by the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting as a fellowship or a peace offering. An offender was guilty of bloodshed, was to be cut off from his people. In verse 5 and verse 6, it says, in order that the children of Israel bring their slaughterings which they slaughter in open field, they shall bring them to Yahweh at the tent of appointment to the priest, and slaughter them as slaughterings of peace offerings to Yahweh. Verse 5. In verse 6, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the slaughter place of Yahweh at the door of the tent of appointment, and shall burn the fat for a free, sweet fragrance. It also gives an indication that this was to eliminate any offerings that would be sacrificed to other gods. And verse 7, and let them no longer slaughter their slaughterings to demons after whom they whored. This is a law for them throughout their generation. Do we have any other thoughts on this before I move to the next slide? Please.
Some people often get confused with this and think that it means that if you wanted to eat meat, you were an Israelite and you wanted to eat meat, you had to sacrifice the animal that you wanted to have as meat before you could eat it. How can I put it?
Well,
all killing of animals to eat had to occur at the tabernacle, but that's not what it says, because it clearly uses the word sacrifice.
Well, I tell you what, can you go to Deuteronomy 12, 20 through 26 and read that? Please, Jerry? Or someone online? I don't want to stop you guys online. I'm looking over here, which makes it look kind of weird, but this is where where I can see people online. But it looks like Jerry's looking that up. Deuteronomy 12, 20 through 26.
So, Deuteronomy 12, starting at 20.
Yeah,
when Yahweh your God enlarges your border as he has promised you, and you say, I shall eat meat, because your soul longs to eat meat, you may eat meat after all the lust of your body. If the place which the Lord your God has chosen to put his name is too far from you, then you will kill of your herd and or of your flock, which Yahweh has given you, as I have commanded you, and you will eat in your gates after the lust of your body, even as the roebuck, it's not Sears, and deer are eaten, so you will eat them. The unclean and the clean alike, you will eat them. Only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you may not eat the life of the flesh. You will not eat it. You will pour it out on the earth as water. You will not eat it, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and then you will do what is right in the sight of the Lord.
So if I'm reading the footnotes from this Torah scholar here, it says that that Deuteronomy makes it clear that an Israelite may slaughter an animal for food wherever he chooses. However, these are not considered offerings to Elohim. And God is not commanding that all meat come from animals sacrificed to him. But animals sacrificed to him needed to be made It couldn't be made anywhere.
Hey,
I have a
Paul.
thought.
Yes.
So the word for ox in the verse is shore. And my recent studies of this word shore, this animal was specifically said, this was an animal that was specifically given as a sacrifice to the Almighty. So I guess what it's saying is whoever has brought a designated animal that's designated for the sacrifice to Yah and has not come and presented it, blood guiltiness is on his hands.
Thank you for that, Mark.
Hey,
May I
Paul.
make a,
Go right ahead. Who's talking? Ralphie, go ahead.
Yeah, back in Deuteronomy, it actually makes it clear. I think I was reading further down to 12:26, and it says, only the set apart or the set apart gifts which you have and your vowed offerings you are to take up to the place which Yahweh chooses, which that would be the tabernacle or the temple. And you shall make your burnt offering. So it does specify it even there, the difference between just when you're out hunting, getting your own game, versus the differences here. Or at least that's how I'm reading it as well, like you said.
Yeah, and it's not just any ox. This is a short ox, which is a designated animal for an offering to the Almighty.
Okay. Was there another comment? I heard another voice.
I had a comment.
Go right ahead.
In connection with your boundaries and God setting an appointed place for these things to happen, to me it's indicative of them coming out of having a very loose attitude about what they do. I mean, the patriarchs didn't have a designated place. So it was different for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But once God set a designated place, then he expected us to respect that. And oddly enough, it's kind of contrary to what we do today. If I were to bring it into today's terms, we have so many people who want to worship God however they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. And they disregard the fact that God has set very specific things in place for his purposes. And when we ignore those things and we are just willy-nilly about it and we don't follow it, then we bring harm upon ourselves.
Very true. Any other comments? Okay. So, this prohibition about blood, God seems quite serious about this commandment not to eat blood. What was the reason given for not eating blood? Jerry?
The life of the creature is in the blood, and the
Okay.
blood has been given as atonement for our sin, and it is not to be treated in any other way. So eating the blood would be to be treating it inappropriately.
Is that a boundary?
Boundary.
Okay. Well, what happened to one who disobeyed this commandment? I believe it's in verse 10.
God sets his face against that man, and he will be cut off from his people. And I heard an interesting thing that relates this to the thing Paul said about turning a person over, giving a person over to Satan. And he drew an equivalent, this speaker drew a parallel between being cut off from your people and a person being turned over to Satan. He did that, I think, in Corinthians or somewhere.
Yeah, I know we discussed that a little bit earlier in Leviticus, where the person, the Matzorah, the one who was outside of the camp, that was equal to being spiritually dead, even though they were physically alive. Because while they were outside of the camp, They could not have a relationship with Yahweh. They could not even go back to their household or have a relationship with family, their business, anything that was inside of the camp, they were prohibited from. And if they had Sarat their entire life, then outside of the camp they would be their entire life. And that's when you look at it from the standpoint of returning into the camp, being born again, or basically gaining a life back or a renewal to life, then understanding that contrast between being cut off and restored, is a pretty weighty matter. It's not something to be taken lightly. So out of the goodness of the Father, he's establishing boundaries, parameters, borders, however we choose to say it. And quite honestly, when we look back to if the Father set the borders of the earth and the elements of the earth, what we call nature, responds and respects the borders, how much more should we? Are we above creation? No, we are creation. So these borders. And then when we come to the word of Elohim, isn't that an ancient boundary? That we should say, okay, there's a boundary established here that we should not cross, and let's not cross it. We may not understand it. Like some people may say, well, I don't understand the prohibition against blood. It doesn't make sense to me. But that's not really the issue, whether we understand, if we stop and think about it. So we talked about blood again, and let me just say that let me ask the question, does it make sense? Does the commandment not to eat blood make sense? And I'll try to answer that myself and say yes and maybe no. But I'm going to throw something out there and I'm not going to try to answer it. If you could be fed intravenously, could you be fed blood intravenously? There are some people and there are some religious groups that believe even a blood transfusion is similar to eating blood, gaining life by it. I'm not going to go there, but I already did. Just something to weigh and think about. So maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, huh? So God says that he would cut off that person, that the life of the animal is in the blood, and God has given it to the people to make atonement for their lives in verse 11. The just punishment for sin is death, but God has graciously allowed animals to die in our place. The animal's spilled blood is proof or evidence that he gave it life for our sin. So before we move on to any other comments on chapter 17 before we get into chapter 18?
Paul, I think something else to consider, especially, you asked the question, the importance of the blood. And not that I see it completely clear, but I'm sure it goes back to Adam and Hava and what was used for their covering to, and the impact of what that was and continues until the Messiah and all of that. I'm sure somewhere there's a huge connection there.
Well, Ralphie, I'm glad you brought that up. I would have skipped it if you hadn't brought it up. It says right here in the guidebook that I'm using, it says that it's clear that Elohim places special value on blood From the very beginning, we know that the result of sin is death. Genesis 2:17. When Adam and Hawa first sinned, Elohim graciously allowed them to substitute the life of an animal in place of their own. It was the blood of this animal that provided proof that life had been given to atone for their sins. God considers all life sacred from his perspective, and as found in Leviticus 17:11 and Deuteronomy 12:23, life is in the blood. Eating blood then profanes that which God considers sacred. Just something popped in my head as I was thinking about this. Killing that animal in the garden I don't think was a casual thing. I think that would be the first time that Adam and Eve or Adam and Hawa would have seen a slaughtering take place if they were present at all. So the blood is spilled. They get skins to cover their body. That's kind of a horrible reminder in a way. Do you think? Any other thoughts on chapter 17 about the boundary of eating blood forbidden? All right. If there are no other thoughts, then let's jump into chapter 18. And would somebody like to read verses 1 through 30? If not, Jerry? Sure. I'd love it for you to read, sir.
Okay. Chapter 18.
Chapter 18, yes.
And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am Yahweh your God. You will not do after the doings of the land of Egypt in which you dwelled, and after the doings of the land of Canaan where I bring you. You will not do. Neither will you walk in their ordinances. You will do my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am Yahweh your God. You will therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he will live in them. I am Yahweh. None of you will approach anyone that is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am Yahweh. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you will not uncover. She is your mother, and you will not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you will not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, the daughter of your mother, whether she is born at home or born abroad, their nakedness you will not uncover. The nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, their nakedness you will not uncover, for theirs is your own nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, begotten of your father, she is your sister. You will not uncover her nakedness. You will not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's near kinswoman. You will not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, for she is your mother's near kinswoman. You will not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. You will not approach his wife. She's your aunt. You will not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife, and you will not uncover her nakedness. You will not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. You will not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. Neither will you take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness, for they are her near kinswomen. It is incest. Neither will you take a wife together with her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, beside the other in her lifetime. Also, you will not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is put apart for her uncleanness. Moreover, you will not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. You will not let any of your seed pass through the fire of Molech. Neither will you profane the name of God. I am Yahweh. You will not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Neither will you lie with any beast or to defile yourself with it. Neither will any woman stand before a beast to lie down with it. It is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these things, for the nations that I have cast out before you are defiled in all of these, and the land is defiled. Therefore, I visit its iniquity upon it, and the land itself vomits out its inhabitants. You will therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and neither your homeborn nor any stranger that lives among you will commit any of these abominations. For all these abominations the men of the land that were before you have done, and the land has become defiled. So the land will not vomit you out also when you defile it, like it vomited out the nations that were before you. For whoever will commit any of these abominations, even those who commit them, will be cut off from among their people. Therefore you will keep my ordinance. You will not commit any of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that you do not defile yourselves by them. I am Yahweh your God! Exclamation point.
That's the reason. That's it. That's again, a lot of times when we think of boundaries, we think of prohibitions that we can't do something to have fun. But on the other hand, if you're driving down the road and I say, stop, don't go past that marker there. Well, why? There's a cliff, and that cliff will take you off, and you will die. Then it makes perfect sense because we can see death immediately in front of us. And we say, wow, I'm so glad that you told me to stop. I would have kept straight when I should have turned, or I would have turned when I should have kept straight, and so on. So the boundaries there are for a reason. They're for our protection, especially when we have a loving and merciful God who knows what's best and who can see the end from the beginning. The boundaries are established for a reason. So as the passage opens, which societies does God caution the Israelites not to copy? In the very beginning. Egypt. Why? Why not copy Egypt? Wasn't Egypt a world power? Weren't they one of the great civilizations of the day? Who wouldn't want to be Egypt? Come on, Jerry, what do you mean? Don't copy Egypt. You guys, why? They talk more about Egypt in the history books than they do Israel.
You're asking me, I think it's because he says that all of these detestable sexual perversions were practiced by the Egyptians, and God found them abominable, and he therefore destroyed the civilization.
Okay. We have to keep in mind also that they came out of Egypt, and God had selected a people, wanted them to be set apart, kadosh, holy unto him, and that their qualities would be completely different than the nations around them, because the nations around them did detestable things. Did something happen up here? Okay, hold on, guys. I'm going to have to share my screen here. Okay. Which one? All right, we're back. Sorry about that. So, understanding that the boundaries that the Father was giving, I would use the word as reestablishing them into a God-centered culture, not just any God, but the Elohim of creation. Because if you look at countries, most countries are identified by one, a language, a culture, and that culture influences how people perceive the world around them, a worldview, so to speak. And that would shape whether this practice is acceptable, whether this is not acceptable. I'll tell you a short story. Years ago, I was on a business trip going to Mongolia. And before I went, I was briefed about the culture in Mongolia. In the US, if I handed you something, I could hand it to you with my left hand or my right hand, and nobody would think anything of it. But there, you did not hand or receive anything with the left hand. It was always a right hand or both hands that you would give and you would receive. It was disrespectful and dishonorable to do anything different. That was a slight cultural nuance. And I understand that there are some African cultures that do the same thing, that if you try to shake hands with a certain hand, they will slap your hand away because it's considered dirty. Because in their culture, that is the hand that you use to wipe yourself after you've finished doing your business. So understanding that they came out of Egypt, a place that the Father says, you must not do any of these practices. This is pretty much, these are the practices that they had pretty much known. And everyone, all of their life. And even if it was a little bit of some of the ancient practices of their forefathers, it was still a hybrid of practices because they had been in that world, the world of Egypt. And now they were going into another land, and he's telling them not to even do as these people do in the land of Canaan. Because what they had done in that land was despicable also. They had done all these abominations that the Father has established and said, don't cross this border, don't do that. Because if you do, what will happen to them if they don't follow these customs? The land will vomit you out, Jerry said. Instead, they are to obey the laws and live by them, or I like to use the term instructions, or respect the boundaries and live by them because he made a covenant with them and they had promised to obey his instructions.
Hey, Paul.
Yes.
You know, what's interesting, if we look at the, how do I put it, just the basic character and nature of our God, he has not changed one bit. Because what we see here, you will be evicted, vomited out of the land. That's no different in the garden. They got evicted for, it's, you know what I'm saying? It's the same idea at work. Disobedience got eviction. Here, if you don't obey, you get evicted or death, which is probably one and the same.
Thank you, Ralphie. Any other comments from those of you online? So let's talk a little bit about unlawful sexual relations. What are some of the restrictions that were placed by Yahweh on sexual relations? There's a whole list of them. Come on, guys. You're going to make me comment? Jerry, thank you for saving me here. You know what it's like up here, Jerry.
Yeah, I can feel for you. When you read through the list, based on what we know by the way most of us were raised, a lot of them I always cringe when I read some of this stuff, because I think to myself, who in the world would have even thought of this? But it basically seems to make the primary focus what we call today, I guess, the nuclear family. One father and one mother and kids that behave themselves appropriately. There's no promiscuity, or it's when you make a marriage commitment, it's to one partner for life, and you make those things exclusively. And it seems to me, I mean, like I say, from my standpoint, it's kind of like common sense. But on the other hand, when he says that both Egypt and the land they came from, and Canaan, the land they're going to, did all of these things, evidently it was not at all uncommon in those times.
Yeah. Yeah, it says that there was to be no sexual relations with close relatives, your mother, your father's wife, your aunts, your sisters, your sister-in-law, your daughters, your daughter-in-law. And like you said, obviously these were some of the practices that they did around them.
Verse 7 explains the situation with Noah, when it talked about that his son had uncovered the father's nakedness. So 7 explains what that's referring to.
You want to go into details about that, Mark?
Well, it's just so when we're reading the story about what happened with Noah and when they came off the boat, it just said that he had covered his father's nakedness. Well, it makes it seem as though they saw their dad naked, but when you're reading verse 7, it explains what the father's nakedness is. The father's nakedness is literally the mother's nakedness. So that's what had happened with Noah's son and the whole issue. So my opinion on it, I should say.
Can you guys think of any other examples from the Bible in which these instructions were violated?
There are many places where it was violated. I mean, one that comes to my mind is Reuben laying with his father's concubine. The whole idea of concubines doesn't seem particularly in concert with this. There's, one of David, when he was king, one of his sons had sex with one of his half-sisters, and on and on and on. There's all kinds of examples of this in the Bible.
Yeah. The one that you mentioned, Reuben having sex or sexual relations with Jacob's concubine Bilhah, that's in Genesis 35:22. Judah having relations with his son's wife Tamar in Genesis 38, and that was supposed to be promised to one of Judah's sons, but he, oh well. Jacob married 2 sisters. That caused many problems, as we know. And then also, it was common for Egyptians to marry siblings, and the Canaanites practiced child sacrifices to Molech. Now, it's interesting because here it's talking about detestable practices, and when you look at this, first thing you think of, this is just strictly sexual relationships. Why would Molech be part of this verse here in chapter 18? Why would that come into play on verse 21? And
Paul,
go right ahead.
what I think, I haven't done any in-depth, but over the years, piecing things together, the thing with Molech had a lot to do with sexual acts that played a whole part in there. Interesting that it's in the middle of this type of behavior as well, of a form of worship too.
Yeah. Another thought is if they were in a covenant relationship with Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, that's similar to a covenant relationship of a man and woman being together. So quite often, we will see that the Father uses the expression whoring after other gods as if they had prostituted themselves because they were violating that covenant. So it would not be a big stretch to say, yeah, I could see, because if they're making a sacrifice to any god, whether it was Molech or anyone else, then that was the same thing as violating the covenant. They said, yes, we will do all the things that you say. We will abide by the terms or the boundaries of this covenant.
Paul,
Yes.
one of the things about the scripture when it talks about don't pass your children through the fire to Molech, a lot of people imagine that they put babies on these statues that are burning and stuff like that. And there may have been some of that. But one of the practices they did is they had temple priests, and they would, just in the same way it talks about not to let your seed pass to Molech. Well, the seed were referred to are considered children. They were considered your unborn children, your progeny. And so when they would practice these sexual relations before Molech as a form of worship and basically offering their progeny, their seed, that's a type of what it's talking about here.
Thank you, Wanda.
I have a comment about that as well.
Go right ahead,
So
Mark.
I've talked about it before, this word Molech. It comes from the root word of king, and it's any seat of authority, whether civil government or any other seat of authority. So when people are giving their children over to abortion, they're doing it because the seat of authority of the nation has said it's okay. So the whole Molech thing is carrying on through abortion.
Thank you.
My opinion.
So in the slide that's up on the screen right now, you see one path, and then it breaks off into two different paths. We live in a world, and as they did, or many people think, we can go our own way. We can go in whatever direction that we choose. So this brings us to the issue of what is God's view of homosexuality? I'll give you a clue, verse 22. Go ahead, Jerry. You look like you're eager.
Not eager. Verse 22 in this version says, "You will not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination."
Okay. Now, what I find interesting, when I got to that, I thought I was going to see several paragraphs and so on. But what else needs to be explained? It basically says you should not. There's a boundary there. It's established. That's it. And especially in light of all the other boundaries that were established, even with the opposite sex, not sleeping with your daughter or your mother and so on. It's like this. It's like, okay. I think what the Father said, I don't need to dwell here. You understand. So in verses 24 through 30, how does God describe these practices? Anybody online, please? Jerry's probably getting tired of picking up the mic and answering questions.
Well, they defile yourself. If they defiling yourself, then ultimately you're defiling the image of our God in one way or another as well.
Yep. Go right ahead, Jerry.
One of the things that's always interested me is the fact that it defiles the land. God is very, he's protective. It's his land. and he's divided it up and given different groups different parcels of land. But when you do these things, it says it defiles the land. And that goes back, to me, it takes me back to Genesis, what is it, chapter 2 or 3, I guess, where Cain kills Abel, and God says, his blood cries to me from the ground. So this idea of the ground being defiled and the ground vomiting out the inhabitants is something that worth cogitating on a while.
Yeah, it is interesting when you think about it, because that's a strong term, that the ground would vomit them out. And the previous landowners of Canaan, that was the practices that they did. So it was God's legal right to remove them from the land that they were going to remove them off the land. Please.
The other thing that's interesting about that, if you ask me, is how did God implement the vomiting out of the Canaanites, for example? Well, he used the Israelites.
Yeah.
The Israelites were the source of the expulsion and destruction of the Canaanites. But if you look at history, that's always the way God does it. He uses one group of people to execute his judgment on another.
Yeah. So,
I have a comment.
please go right ahead.
So the Greek says, where it says vomit, in the Greek it says that the land will become angry with you. So if we were to think about it, in what way could the land become angry with the people? Volcano, hurricanes, earthquakes. This is real simple ways that the land could become angry with the people for the defiling of it.
There are several places in Scripture also, Mark, and I know you're aware of this, but just to be said, where it talks about the land will not render its produce. I mean, what was the first thing that he told them when they were being kicked out of Eden? That it would not bear the fruit to the volume or capacity that it could.
That's angry, isn't it?
That's angry. And when we think about, there are times when Israel, when God said, I withdrew rain from you, and I withdrew the fruit of your labors and your crops. Why? Because of their detestable practices. So not only is the land defiled, but when a person is defiled, or a whole nation is defiled, what does that even look like? I mean, are they as good as dead? Unless they repent, turn, and come back. So it's not too far off in this chapter that we're doing in terms of Leviticus, where we came out. Again, I keep going back to the previous chapters because I'm seeing these patterns of the person who has leprosy because of a wicked tongue, and then all of a sudden the precautions that the priests would need to take before they even approached the father. When they were coming in, they couldn't approach them any way they wanted to. And then we jump over to this next one where we're talking about blood and how eating blood is prohibited. And then we start talking about unlawful relationships. Ward, do you have a comment?
Just have a question. I couldn't get to the microphone earlier because I'm working on the live stream, and so I apologize. I just want to go back and verify, make sure I understood something I heard earlier. Were you talking about the fact that Yahweh is telling the people that they were not to copy things from Egypt? Is that correct, or how was that being stated?
Yeah.
Not to copy things out of Egypt.
Not to copy the practices of the Egyptians or the Canaanites.
Right. Any exceptions to that?
Well,
because I can think of an exception.
What's the exception?
Huh?
Because he's talking about the abominable practices.
Right.
And he's very specific in this chapter what some of those practices are. But sure, go for it.
Okay, in the early 1900s, archaeologists discovered a physical object in Egypt. It was a big rock engraving called a stele. It was a real object that was really discovered, that they presented in papers that they wrote. And there was writing on this rock and a floor plan. an actual floor plan drawn of Ramses II's war tent. And that is an exact duplicate, and prior to, according to the mainstream narrative, the tabernacle. Yahweh's tabernacle that was shown to Moses from a pattern in heaven. Why would Yahweh copy Ramses II's war tent to be his house, his tabernacle? I think this was presented as being the case by those early archaeologists, and their philosophical foundation in the schools that they learned their trade from, the foundational philosophy was Marxist atheism. So these were not friends of Yahweh. And they said, when they found this and presented it and wrote their papers, they said the Hebrews, who were not imaginative and not creative, copied it as the tabernacle. And it's been accepted that way ever since. But it just struck me that we're saying, don't copy stuff out of Egypt, and yet this horrible thing of Ramses II, his war tent, is a copy that Yahweh made. I find that to be insane. That people are accepting it to this day.
Yeah.
It just boggles my mind.
So let me toss a challenge out there just to consider, because I don't really have a good answer. But since I'm up here and I can throw one out to you, since it's the pattern that's made in heaven, and the watchers know what the pattern of the tabernacle in heaven is, could it be possible that they gave them a vision of what that pattern looks like? So it's not the Hebrews that are copying after the Egyptians, it's the Egyptians that are copying off the pattern in the heavens? Is that possible?
Maybe, but I don't think Yahweh would allow it, number one. But number two, we've learned from the research done and presented in the movie Patterns of Evidence that the Hebrews left Egypt 200 years before Ramses II.
Okay.
So who's copying who? But why would the Egyptians, if you read the book that came out with Patterns of Evidence, they have a discussion about the fact that for hundreds of years after the Exodus, the Egyptians hated the Hebrews. They wiped all their records of the Hebrews. They wanted nothing to do with them. They wanted nothing of the Hebrews. So if Ramses II had copied one of their tabernacle for his war tent, he wouldn't have been the leader for very long.
Yeah.
I mean, that again gets back to this insane concept. You no matter how you go around the subject, you end up back to something being just off the charts crazy. There's no way that Ramses II would have copied the Hebrews that destroyed Egypt, that he would copy their tabernacle to be his war tent.
Yeah.
That's insanity.
Yeah. Well, Ward, this is certainly going to take a lot more discussion than we have time for.
I wanted to bring it up for people to
appreciate it.
think about and be aware of. The documents are published. I have copies of them. They were published in Biblical Archaeology Review. This is not made up. This is real. It really happened. It got into the educational system and into the popular culture. And people need to know and learn the roots of this so they can start studying it.
Yeah. I got less than 2 minutes to go, Ward. So thank you. Appreciate it. So everyone out there, everyone here, it is for us to do our due diligence and test everything that I'm saying, test everything that Mark's saying, read and examine the scriptures. And, Ward certainly studies a lot, and that's what he says also. Unlawful sexual relationships. This one-way sign that we see that Elohim is established has been knocked down by society, not only in ancient cultures, not only the Israelites or anyone else, but also today. So we can see about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Homosexuality was detestable. In verses 24 to 30, God describes these practices and what the people who lived in these lands and what it did. We can see how it ties into Genesis 15:16, and God calls these practices detestable, and that the current inhabitants had been defiled, and the land itself had become defiled, and the land would vomit them out. So we can see that even in Genesis chapter 15, 16, God said to Abraham that the sins of the Amorites had not reached its full measure. So some of these could have been the sins that the Amorites had also committed. So were these laws only for Israelites? No. If they were, these other people, they wouldn't have been vomited out of the land. So we talked about blood. We kind of did a review on Yom Kippur, boundaries, and what it means to be set apart, holy. The Day of Atonement is clearly an important day. And we kind of reviewed how these boundaries function in Leviticus chapter 17 regarding animal blood and sexual practices. I'm going to go to one other slide, and this will be the last slide for tonight. I find it interesting that the word here, boundary, is gebul. It's properly a cord as twisted, that is, by implication, a boundary, a border. And when I saw the photo of the barbed wire twisted around, I thought, well, we recognize that as a boundary we do not cross. But when we look into the word of Elohim, sometimes we see these and we say, this is a law. Oh, well, this is not for us. This is for the Israelites. This is for this nation. It's not for today. But I hope we can come to an agreement that these things, if they were detestable before, they're still detestable today, and that these boundaries were established for a reason. I want to thank everybody for joining us, those of you online, those who you came out. And Jerry, I'm so happy to see you here. It's great to have you in company with us. And let's close with prayer, please. Heavenly Father, Yahweh, Abba, we thank you for your word. We thank you that you've established the boundaries from the beginning of all creation. Your way is a way of order, not chaos. And Father, if we line our thinking and our hearts up with your ways, we will be walking according to your word and respecting your boundaries. It gives us an opportunity to come into fellowship and have a relationship with you, and have the proper relationship with our fellow man that would be showing not only love for Father, for you, but love for our neighbor. So I ask that you watch over us and you keep us until we can meet again. And I ask these things in Yeshua's name. Amen. So thank you guys online. Thank you here. And we'll see you next time.